Hi, LA Progressive friends and family and readers. Today, I'm really delighted to be joined by James Farr, who contributes regularly to the LA Progressive and has his own Convo Live. And I'm joining James Farr is joined by Bob Butler, who is a journalist from Northern California. But James is going to tell us a little bit more about Bob Butler. Go ahead, James.
Thank you, Sharon, and I'm so honored to have Bob Butler join us this afternoon. Bob has had a very storied 42-year career in broadcast journalism, a reporter. He's known as a reporter's reporter, but he is a Peabody Award-winning journalist. He is a Murrow Award-winning journalist, and also is the former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, which I am a proud member of. So thanks for joining us today, Bob.
My pleasure.
So we're having this interview. What prompted this interview was James and I interviewed a couple last week, the Josephs, Andrew and Deanna Joseph, and I'll put a link to that at the bottom of this interview. And the Josephs tragically lost their 14-year-old son to negligence, the sheriffs in the Florida community where they live. And James, and after that interview, James and I were talking about how impactful it is to be a Black journalist and to report on issues that have a terrible negative impact on the lives of Black people and sometimes on our own personal lives, the psychological and emotional toll that takes on Black journalists. And James brought up Bob Butler. So I'm going to stop talking now. And James, you and Bob can have at it.
Well, Bob, again, thank you so much for being here with us. Sharon, we published last week the piece, Black Media Trauma Between the Headlines. And that was a very personal and vulnerable piece for myself, because I was telling my own story and how covering these stories like the Josephs that you mentioned has an impact, that there's a toll that's paid, and how we are exposed to trauma. And so we're just coming out of May. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And it was on my heart to write this piece, just really to release it and let it go. And I couldn't think of a better person to speak with that would be most informed, just knowing his history. And that's why I reached out to Bob. We call him Uncle Bob. That's another story, but Bob, again, thank you so much for being here with us. One of the things you told me is don't hold on to it, right? You got to get it out. Just give us a little bit of background on, kind of catch the audience up with how we started into our conversation.
Well, I think it really goes to what we as journalists, whether you're Black, white, or other, do every day. We cover the news, and a lot of times we cover tragedy. We talk to the parents of murdered children, of murdered mothers and fathers. We talk to people who've lost their homes in floods and hurricanes. We talk to people whose house has burned down. A lot of the stuff we do is tragic. And, it's hard to cover those kinds of news stories and not take in some of that tragedy yourself. I mean, the amount of trauma that we take in, I would say on a weekly or monthly basis, if you keep that bottled up inside, it can come out in a negative way. So it's very important that you talk to people, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a friend, whether it's, your spouse. You need to talk to somebody about it, because the more you hold in all that you've covered, the better of a chance it is of it coming out in a way that you don't want.
Yeah, I had to realize things were getting on my last nerve, right? I got irritable. I would notice when I'd come home from these trips, it would take me a couple of days to kind of, decompress, but also process. And, there's not really anybody else other than those who were there. And you don't want to, risk kind of re-traumatizing them. We do that in a sense to kind of get clarity on a story. Sometimes you have to kind of go back and, did I hear this right? Did I get this right? Who's in this picture? Those are things that take us back into that space again. And I believe it's the vagus nerve. And it just, as I just was irritable, right? And I couldn't stop thinking about some of these stories, right? And as Sharon was talking about the jokes, I mean, we all have children. You have a son, Bob. Sharon, you have sons. I have a son, and I just could not let go of the idea of this 14-year-old boy being turned out onto a highway in the middle of nowhere, and hearing his father and his mother testify in court, what that evening was like, how they found out, how the police had to notify them, and then how the police went with the narrative that really vilified a 14-year-old boy. And I just couldn't help but see myself. When I looked at that family, I couldn't help but see my own son. And it affected me so much that all I could do was report out on the radio on KBLA. I couldn't even bring myself to come back and try to form and some words to try to adequately tell that story. Thinking about some of the lessons that you learned, you had shared with me a film that you watched that your union had called you guys in to tell us a little bit more about breaking news, breaking down, and kind of how that gave you some resources or at least an understanding.
Yeah, we have within SAG-AFTRA, we have the Broadcast Steering Committee. We're mandated to meet like 3 times a year. And we had a meeting in New York, and they brought in this anchor, a former anchor from Washington, D.C., and he produced a documentary called Breaking News, Breaking Down. It targeted specifically at the trauma that journalists face constantly, and how it affects our everyday lives, how it affects our jobs. And in this particular video, he highlighted a gentleman who was a photographer for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. And he, specifically after Hurricane Katrina and Rita back in 2005, this photographer was out every day shooting video of all this tragedy. And it maybe was a year or so later, he just had a nervous breakdown and just lost it and was speeding around town, breaking laws. And he finally got arrested. And they determined that it was because of all of he had done, all the tragedy he had seen, all the people's who had the horrible stories about not only losing their homes, but also losing their loved ones in the flood, that he had kept all this in and it came out in a negative way.
I have a question here, and thank you, Bob, so much for sharing that and giving us insight into how journalists, particularly those that belong to your organization, how they learn and support each other through trauma. But I'm interested more specifically in the additional trauma, and maybe this is just my perception, but the additional trauma when you are a person of color and you see a sort of a callous disregard when Black people, Black men, Black children, there's this term called missing white woman syndrome, where it's known that if you want the story to really get a lot of traction, it's better if the person who has been harmed is a white woman. And do your organizations address that?
Well, we know it. It's something that we accept happens. I did a story about a young boy who was basically kidnapped when he was an infant up in Vallejo, California. He was kidnapped. His mother was murdered. And the baby boy disappeared. It was, I think, 6 or 7 years later, maybe 8 years later, that the boy was located living across town with another woman who was arrested for the murder of his mother. Now, his aunt said she kept trying to get coverage of this story. She called, Oprah. She called, Montel Williams. She called all these people, and nobody wanted to do anything about the story. At the same time, the Elizabeth Smart story was playing, who was kidnapped, I think it was in Utah. And there was a lot of coverage on that. So you're right, this does happen. We understand that. It's frustrating for us when we have a missing person like that. And a lot of times, you talk to law enforcement, well, they just ran away. Well, it's not always a runaway, and it's not always somebody who's out up to no good. And it's frustrating that you can't get the kind of coverage that Elizabeth Smart got for this young boy that disappeared in Vallejo. So we understand that. We do our best to make the case that we should be covering the story. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. One of the biggest problems, I think, is that the people who make the decisions behind the scenes on what news is covered oftentimes don't look like us, and they can't relate to what we're saying.
So I'm wondering if in the aftermath of George Floyd and the global protests, if after that there was a change at all in mainstream media, corporate media. So yes, I publish an independent daily digital publication, but it's a tiny publication, and I pretty much call the shots. But in larger outlets, was there a change in the way that the news is reported after George Floyd's tragic murder?
I think there was in the very beginning, but it didn't take long for that to go away, to go back to business as usual. And that's been a problem for years. Think back to, I know you guys are all too young to remember this, but think back to the long hot summers back in the 60s. And they commissioned what they called the Kerner Commission to look at why were people rioting in Watts and in New Jersey and Chicago and wherever they were rioting. And one of the parts of that report said that one of the reasons why people act this way is because they don't see themselves in the media. The only time they see themselves in the media is when they're committing crimes or whether they're the victims of crime. And the Kerner Commission basically said that one of the problems is that these publications, these news organizations don't employ enough journalists of color. You might remember during that long hot summer, journalists of color Black journalists were hired because they were the ones that could go into Watts and get the story. If a person who was not Black went in there could be problems. So a lot of these journalists were hired to work for these publications, but as soon as the Civil Rights Act passed, and then after Martin Luther King was murdered, pretty soon these same journalists found that while they were hired to be on the front lines to cover the police, to cover the riots and things, once all that died down, now they're covering garden parties. They're doing obits. They're not really covering City Hall or the police commission or things like that. And that, ironically, was the impetus to reform the National Association of Black Journalists, because these folks got tired of being put to the side, being ignored, not being promoted. And that's one of NABJ's missions, is to make sure that journalists are hired and promoted. So it's kind of a lot of information, but you're right. We have to understand what it takes to get the story covered, and we have to advocate for it. But we also we kind of get tired of having to advocate for the Black stories. I want to cover City Hall. I want to cover Sacramento. I want to cover, Google and Apple. I don't want to just go to East Oakland when there's a shooting.
Right, but that desire to be seen as having the capacity to cover just straight up news, just like anyone else of any other race, that expression happens in the newsroom. I mean, so you have to actually be there as a member of the journalistic body, even to express that. So it's really important that you be there so that you can express that. It's really important.
I forget who it was that said that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's right. That's right. And so it's why it's important that NABJ do what they do. So why don't you spend a little bit of time talking about NABJ? And I hope you're not hearing my cat. I have a cat that had surgery, and she's got on one of those.
That's fine.
And she's scratching.
I can't hear it.
Oh, good.
So NABJ was created back in the mid 70s for the reasons I already outlined, because these journalists were hired to cover the news and found themselves being shunted off to the side. So one of the missions of NABJ is to get journalists hired and promoted, but also to advocate for fair coverage of our communities. Because a lot of times, like I said, you don't see yourself in the news in a positive light. I was down in Brazil in 2007, talking to Black journalists down there. And, I said, well, one of the issues that we have in the United States is that the only time you see Black people in the news is if we're being arrested or if we're dancing. And they just kind of sat back stunned, because the same thing happens in Brazil. So it's something that we're dealing with. I know, in the Western part of the world, I'm sure it happens in other areas too. Maybe not for Black people. It could be if you're a Uyghur, if you're in China or some other minority ethnic minority, but it does happen, and it's difficult to get past. How do you fix that? That's the thing we have to work on. And NABJ has worked on that for a number of years. We're approaching our 50th anniversary. And we've had a lot of wins, but the struggle continues, which is really too bad, because after George Floyd, having to explain to people why it's important that we cover this story, and why is it important that we don't just accept the police narrative of what happened when you have the police saying one thing and you have video showing something else. That's very important for us.
Yes, yes, yes. So, I'm thankful that and actually there was a time, I don't know if my membership has lapsed, but the LA Progressive was a membership of the local Los Angeles chapter.
Right.
We had a newscaster here, Beverly White, who was the chair of the Los Angeles chapter of NABJ. She recently retired. So she and her husband are just kind of like retired people now.
Well, first Bev was the president, and then Xavier became the president. So, and that was for a number of years. They've retired and now abandoned California and moved back to Florida.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how long they're going to last, because I think they're too woke.
Yeah, Florida certainly would not have been my first choice.
But that's where Xavier's from. He's from Florida, so
Oh,
they have a lot of connections there.
I see, I see. Well, I think Beverly's from Texas.
Yeah,
So-
she is.
So
But,
neither of those states would have been.
yeah, but you can check on your member. You can just go online to see if you're still a member, and it's very easy to renew. You can do it online. And I
Well,
would encourage you to do that, because I think we need not just journalists to be members, but also organizations and
yes,
publications to be members also.
yes, yes. I certainly will do that. Well, it looks like we've lost James. So I don't know what happened. I guess there was a problem with this connection. So I think that we've covered a lot in this discussion. We've certainly covered enough for me to put together a nice video. I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Don't stop it quite yet, because one of the things about the progressive, I'm not sure people understand this, but you ask why we do what we do. We want to tell our own stories, because a lot of times the stories that are told about us by people that aren't like us are not as positive as they could be. And this is not something that started in the 60s, in the 50s. This goes all the way back to 1827 and Freedom's Journal, which is the first the first Black newspaper. And the reason that newspaper was published, and the organizers said, is because we want to tell our own stories. It's very important that we do that.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we started the LA Progressive is because I want to tell our own stories. And I also wanted to ensure that the progressive community have a healthy dosage of our stories delivered directly to their email boxes here in Southern California. So the vast majority of our readers are in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, that's important that we have that. We've had papers up here too, and the problem that Black publications have is, these big companies that will advertise, the LA Times, they might give them dollars, they may give you dimes. It's very difficult to get advertising revenue from these big companies, something that we really need to work on.
Yes, don't I know it? Well,
Yeah.
James has returned. Looks like we had a little bit of a problem. You're on mute, James, if you're getting ready to say something.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on over here. I don't know where I left off with you guys or if
But we
Bob.
started talking about the National Association of Black Journalists.
Okay.
And Bob was talking about the importance of supporting that organization and how that organization serves our communities. And I think serves the greater journalism community.
Yeah, we have our annual convention. This year it's going to be in Birmingham. And if you're a journalist who's looking for a job, we have the largest career fair for journalists in the country, not Black journalists, any journalists. If you come to our convention, you'll see all the major companies are there. CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, the New York Times, the LA Times. You see all these publications are there looking to hire Black journalists. And I've told people who aren't Black journalists, you ought to be a member, because if you're looking for a job, that's the place you want to go, because you can get it. I've had people walk in there without a job, walk out with one.
Wow. I mean, I think that's a great segue. I don't think maybe you had a chance to touch on it, Bob, but when you were president of NABJ, that coincided with the time that the Obama was elected. Can you mind sharing that story about, you met the Obamas, you were in DC and you were covering it, and there's a few
Well, I
gumbo.
mean, so before when I was on the board, we went to the first inauguration, and I didn't meet him then, because there were a couple of other million people in front of me, but just to be there at the inauguration was so powerful. All these people that had come, and normally we get a lot of people together, there's issues. There were no issues that I could see, except for the fact we had to walk like 3 or 4 miles to get to the subway, because every subway you couldn't even get in. There were so many people trying to get in. It was just a wonderful experience, and I did talk to some people about it. I filed back to my station a story on the inauguration, and how people were just so overjoyed, and not just Black people. All kinds of people were there, had a good time, and really enjoyed, and it meant a lot to them to be there at this time in our history.
Wow.
Yeah, well, when we were both there, I believe that was for the first one.
Yeah, 09, in 09.
That was 09. Okay. And so you were talking earlier about Katrina and the photo journalist who, just had a cascade of events that just, fell on him, and he had a break. While you were in DC and Baltimore, we were in Severna Park, right, at a mutual home, and you were making these delicious pots of gumbo. But you learned about a story and something that was happening in Katrina and with folks in New Orleans. And can you share that story, a little bit about that?
Well, I was contracted to go do a story in New Orleans regarding housing that had not been covered. And I'm like, what story has not been covered in New Orleans about Katrina? Because there were hundreds and hundreds of reporters down there from all over the world. But I talked to this woman. I said, what's going on down there that people don't know about? And she said, well, banks are forcing people to pay off their mortgages. And in some cases, they're taking their insurance money and paying off their mortgage. And people don't even know that. So I ended up finding a woman who the bank hadn't forced her to pay off her mortgage. It convinced her to pay off her mortgage. And she had bought her house 6 weeks before Katrina and was homeless. And when I met her, had to have been in 2008, 2009. She had basically been homeless in New Orleans. She had relatives in Kentwood, which is like 90 miles away. So she had to get off work. And this is after they resumed work and school resumed and everything. They had to drive to Kentwood and then get up early in the morning to come back and drop the kids at school and go to work. I mean, very difficult time. And she'd been trying to get her house fixed for a number of years. She tried Salvation Army, Red Cross. She tried everybody to try to get that house fixed. Because the bank convinced her to pay off her mortgage with their insurance money, she was not eligible to receive any federal funding to fix her house. And it wasn't until 2011 that we published that story. And about 6 months later, or 8 months later, she got into a program through the city of New Orleans, and the publisher of Barnes and Noble books started this foundation called Project Home Again. And based on her being exposed to that, she finally was able to get back into a house.
You also uncover some systemic practices.
Well, yeah, I mean, the banks, everybody didn't know what was going to happen in New Orleans, whether the people were going to be able to come home because everything was flooded. And the banks, you know, their modus of operandi was, okay, these people have flood insurance. Let's take the insurance money and pay off the mortgage. That way we're whole. So you had a bunch of people down there that had a home that they owned free and clear, but they couldn't afford to fix it, such as this woman, Kisa. There were a lot of people like that down there. She was lucky that she got into this other program, and she only got into that program because I brought up her name to the mayor when I was down there doing videos for our convention that was going to be coming there in August, and that was, I think, was in May. And he put her in touch with this program, and she got into it. And you know, none of us knew how great it would be for her, because once they got put into this house, it was a brand new house, and it came with a 5-year forgivable mortgage. You live in the house for 5 years, and you own it free and clear. This is a brand new house. Didn't need any repairs or anything. So that was something very fortunate that she did. And had it not been for the story I did, I don't think that would have happened. And in fact, at one point I had a hard time reaching her for like a year, and she finally answered my call, and she admitted that she had been embarrassed because she was embarrassed not having a house, embarrassed having to go to the gas station to use the bathroom, embarrassed about having to sleep in the car with her kids before it was time to go to school. So we finally got her in there, and she says, well, what if we do this story? I said, look, I cannot guarantee you that by doing the story, anything will change. I can guarantee you, if we don't do the story, nothing will change.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did the story, she got the help she needed, and now they've been in the house since 2012, so they own it free and clear.
Wow.
Just pay the tax and the insurance.
And you also mentioned, you know, certainly for a layperson, how difficult it was to understand the banks and everything that was involved. But you also met a lawyer, right, who he threw his hands up, right? He couldn't figure it out.
Well, he didn't quite throw his hands up. So I was researching people that had filed lawsuits regarding homeowners insurance or flood insurance and the banks, and I came across this one lady, and she had an attorney, and his number was in the filing. So I called him up, and he said, "Well, yeah, her case is different. She bought the house, and she agreed to let the mortgage company buy the homeowners insurance, and she was making the payments every month in her mortgage payment, but the company never bought the insurance, so she didn't have any insurance." He said, "But you know, that happened to me too." I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, I had a forced mortgage payoff." He says, "Yeah, my bank sent me they said I had to pay it off." I said, "Well, send me a letter saying I have to pay off the mortgage." And they did, and he did with the insurance money. But then there was this program that created by FEMA called it was the Road Home Project. And the Road Home Project, but you could get $50,000 to help repair your house if you didn't have enough insurance or any insurance at all. And so he, said, "Okay, great." And he went online to look at the manual, and he printed the manual out. It was like this thick. And he said the thing was, he had one expense that he tried that was rejected, and he would call up and talk to one of the advisors, and they said, "No, that's not covered." He said, "Wait a minute, look at page 389, paragraph B." And they would look at, "Oh, you're right, it is covered." He educated himself on the Road Home Project and all the rules and regulations. And I asked him, I says, in New Orleans, 40% of the adults in Orleans Parish are functionally illiterate. That's a study that was done, when I was doing the story. 40%, almost half of the adults really couldn't read or write. And they could find their name on their driver's license, but they couldn't fill out the application. They just didn't know how to do that. And I said, so what chance did the average person have to understand this program and be successful? He said, not a chance. So I went ahead and did this on my own. Had I not done that on my own, I would have been out of luck. And so it's very important to understand that government programs can be very complicated, and you have a population that is not as well educated as you would like them to be. they're going to be victims. You know, and I talked to another attorney, and she said, you know, the problem with all the red tape with Katrina is that people have gone through the trauma of losing their home, in many cases losing a loved one. They're now relocated to Houston. They want to come back to their house. The bank has taken their insurance money to pay it off. Now they own it, but can't afford to fix it. And, you know, they're just, at some point, they just throw up their hand to say, I just give up, because they've gone through so much. And then you add on the bureaucracy of all the red tape. A lot of these people just said, you know, they just walked away. And when I was there driving through like New Orleans East and seeing, you know, blocks and blocks of nothing but chimneys, maybe, you know, or just foundations, yards overgrown with weeds, a house here, a house there. You know, there are a lot of them didn't get rebuilt.
Wow.
Well, this has been a fascinating, informative interview. James and I are also going to include an article that this will be embedded in, and we'll talk more about the NABJ and give some other links to our listeners to help them understand the impact that doing these stories has on journalists. So we thank you, Bob, for joining us. And James, you have anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I'm grateful for Bob's leadership, mentorship, relationship, kinship, just all the ships, right? And you know, we congratulate him on his 42 years in the business, and he's now found a new career. He is a professional honeydewer in his retirement.
Yeah, except not today. I'm not going to do it today. I'm actually going to get back into my recliner. I got up this morning and had batting practice, then went to Zumba, then went to Starbucks, and now I'm back home. And after this, I'll be in my recliner until 6 o'clock when I have another Zumba class, and then that'll be the day. There are links to the stories I talked about in Katrina. There are 2 links. I may have already sent them to James, but if you can find it, look up Kisa, Kisa Holmes, Holmes, comma, The Lens. The Lens is the publication that published the story. And there are 2 stories. One that talks about, you know, after 7 years, they still can't go home. And another one that says they're finally able to go home.
Right. Well, thanks again, Bob Butler. And thank you, James, for joining us once again. So
My pleasure.
We're going to say so long for today. And thank you for joining LA Progressive. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye now.